The blistering afternoon sun beat down on Natalie Morrison as she stood alone on the dusty train platform of Dillon, Montana, her life packed into a single weathered trunk and nowhere to go. The year was 1884, and the promise of a teaching position that had drawn her west had evaporated like morning dew under the unforgiving summer heat. Exhaustion and despair weighed on her shoulders as heavily as the oppressive heat. The station was nearly deserted, most townsfolk having the good sense to seek shelter during the hottest part of the day. Natalie dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief that had long since lost its crisp whiteness, watching the train that had delivered her disappear into the distance, belching black smoke against the azure sky. She had spent her last dollars on the train ticket, believing the letter promising employment at the Dillon schoolhouse. Only upon arrival did the station master inform her that the position had been filled 2 weeks prior. There had been no one to meet her, and now, at 22 years of age, Natalie found herself utterly alone in a strange town, with no money and no prospects. "Madam, you've been standing there near an hour now." The voice startled her, deep and resonant with a slight drawl that marked him as not being from these parts originally. Natalie turned to face a tall man, his skin bronzed from the sun and his eyes the color of the Montana sky. His clothes were dusty but well-kept denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a worn leather vest. The Stetson on his head was pushed back slightly, revealing dark hair that curled at the edges. A gun belt sat comfortably around his hips, but there was nothing threatening in his demeanor. "I'm waiting," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. She wasn't waiting for anyone or anything. She was simply paralyzed by indecision and fear. Waiting for what exactly? He asked, his eyes kind but perceptive. "Train's gone, and next one ain't due till Thursday." Natalie felt tears sting her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not break down in front of a stranger, no matter how desperate her situation. "I had employment arranged," she explained stiffly. "A teaching position, but it seems there was a miscommunication." The man nodded slowly, taking in her trunk, her travel-worn appearance, and the barely concealed panic in her eyes. "Name's Daniel Everett," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Got a ranch about 10 miles outside town. Good land, running cattle mostly." Natalie hesitated before accepting his handshake. "Natalie Morrison, from Boston originally. Long way from home," he observed. "Yes," she said simply, unsure what else to add. Daniel Everett studied her for a moment longer, then bent down and grasped the handle of her trunk with one strong hand. With seemingly effortless strength, he lifted it. "Come live," he said, the words more a statement than a question. "Got a cabin on my property. Used to belong to my foreman before he got married and built his own place closer to town. It's empty now. You can stay there while you figure things out." Natalie stared at him, speechless. Part of her wanted to refuse outright. What kind of woman would accept such an offer from a complete stranger? But the alternative was spending the night on this platform, or worse, seeking charity from the local church, or finding herself in an even more compromising position. "Mr. Everett," she began carefully, "that's very kind, but I couldn't possibly. Ranch needs a school teacher," he interrupted. "Got 5 families working for me. Between them, 12 children getting no proper education. Nearest school's here in town, too far for daily travel." Natalie blinked, her mind racing. "You're offering me employment, room and board plus wages," he confirmed with a nod. "Children need learning. I need someone to teach them. You need somewhere to go." His expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a glimmer of something, kindness perhaps, or understanding. "Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me," Natalie said cautiously. Daniel shifted the trunk to his other hand. Know enough. Lady like yourself doesn't end up stranded at a train station in Montana unless something's gone wrong. Besides, he added with the ghost of a smile, you said you're a teacher. That's what I need. Natalie considered her options, which were admittedly few. This man, this cowboy, was offering her a lifeline when she most needed one. There was something in his straightforward manner that inspired trust, despite all the warnings she'd received about the dangers of the West. "Do I have time to consider?" she asked. "Sure," he replied easily. "I'll be at the general store for the next hour, getting supplies." He set her trunk back down. "Think it through. I'll come back before I head out." With that, he touched the brim of his hat and walked away, boots kicking up little puffs of dust on the platform. Natalie sat down on her trunk, mind whirling. The proposition was unorthodox, certainly, but not indecent. He was offering her employment, housing separate from his own, and a purpose. After the disappointment of the school position, it seemed almost too fortuitous. An hour later, when Daniel returned, Natalie had made her decision. She stood as he approached, smoothing down her travel-wrinkled skirt. "I accept your offer, Mr. Everett," she said, extending her hand. "On a trial basis. If after 1 month either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable, we can part ways with no hard feelings." A smile touched Daniel's lips as he shook her hand. "Fair enough, Miss Morrison." He picked up her trunk again. "Wagon's just over there. We'll stop at the Mercantile for anything you might need before heading out." And so Natalie Morrison, Boston-born and educated, found herself climbing into a wagon beside a man she'd met only hours before, heading toward an uncertain future on a cattle ranch in the wilds of Montana Territory. The wagon creaked and groaned as they made their way through Dillon's Main Street. Natalie took in the wooden buildings, the wide dirt street, and the occasional passerby with interest. It was so different from Boston's crowded streets and brick buildings. "Town's growing," Daniel commented, following her gaze. "Railroad came through 5 years back, changed everything." "How long have you been here?" Natalie asked, genuinely curious. 9 years, he replied. "Came west after the war, worked other men's land until I saved enough to buy my own. Started with 50 acres, built it to over 2,000 now." Natalie was impressed despite herself. "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time." Daniel's hands were steady on the reins. "Had help. Good men working with me. Determination does the rest." He glanced at her. "What brought you all the way from Boston, if you don't mind my asking?" Natalie hesitated, uncertain how much to share. "Limited opportunities," she finally said. "My father passed away last year, left considerable debts. I needed to make my own way." Daniel nodded, asking no further questions as they pulled up in front of the Mercantile. "Might want to get some practical things," he suggested. "Ranch life's different from city living." Inside the store, Natalie selected several sturdy work dresses, boots more suitable for ranch life than her city shoes, and other necessities. She was painfully aware of Daniel settling the bill, adding it to his own purchases of flour, coffee, ammunition, and tools. "I'll repay you from my first wages," she insisted. "No rush," he replied easily. "Consider it an advance." As they loaded the purchases into the wagon, Natalie became aware of curious glances from townsfolk. A woman approached, her expression friendly but inquisitive. "Daniel Everett, aren't you going to introduce your friend?" she asked, her eyes taking in Natalie's city clothes and Daniel's protective stance. "Mrs. Hollister," Daniel nodded respectfully. "This is Miss Morrison, new teacher for the ranch children." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? Well, welcome to Dillon, Miss Morrison. I'm sure you'll find our little community quite different from what you're used to." "Thank you," Natalie replied politely. "I'm looking forward to the experience." As they drove away, Daniel explained, Martha Hollister. Runs the boarding house. Husband owns the bank. Nice enough folks, but town's small, news travels fast. They'll think it's strange, Natalie observed. A single woman going to live on your ranch, Daniel shrugged. People always talk. What matters is we know the truth of things. The journey to the Everett ranch took nearly 3 hours. As they left town behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills, stands of pine trees, and vast stretches of grassland dotted with cattle. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "It's beautiful," Natalie breathed, taking in the wild splendor of it. "Different kind of beautiful than what you're used to, I expect," Daniel said. "Yes, but no less magnificent for being different." Daniel looked pleased at her response. "Land gets in your blood out here, changes you." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they crested a hill, and Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop. Below them stretched a valley, green and lush compared to the drier surrounding hills. A creek wound through it, its course marked by cottonwood trees. Near the center stood a large, well-built log house, several outbuildings and corrals. Smoke rose from chimneys and figures moved about, engaged in end-of-day chores. "Everett Ranch," Daniel said, a note of pride in his voice. "Home." Natalie felt a flutter of nerves. This was real now, this new life she had chosen in a moment of desperation and hope. Daniel must have sensed her apprehension. "The cabin's a bit apart from the main house," he explained, pointing to a smaller structure nestled against a stand of trees about a quarter-mile from the main buildings. "Gives you privacy, but close enough if you need anything." As they approached the ranch, several men stopped their work to watch the wagon arrive. Daniel raised a hand in greeting but drove past the main house, following a well-worn track to the cabin he had mentioned. It was a simple structure, built of logs with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Daniel set the brake and jumped down from the wagon, coming around to help Natalie descend. "It's not fancy," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's solid. Keeps warm in winter, cool enough in summer." He carried her trunk and new purchases onto the porch and pushed open the door. Natalie followed him inside, unsure what to expect. The cabin was basic but clean and surprisingly welcoming. One large room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace along one wall. A door led to what Natalie assumed was a bedroom. The furnishings were simple but sturdy: a table with 4 chairs, a comfortable-looking armchair near the fireplace, shelves holding a few books and essential items. "Mary Foreman's wife came by yesterday to clean up and stock some basics," Daniel explained. "Flour, coffee, sugar in the pantry there. Wells just outside, pumps in working order. Outhouse is around back." He hesitated. "Not what you're used to, I expect." "It's perfect," Natalie said, surprised to find she meant it. After the uncertainty of the train platform, this solid cabin with its promise of safety and purpose felt like a luxury. Daniel nodded, seeming pleased. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come to the main house for supper in an hour if you're up to it. Meet the others." He paused at the door. "Or I can have someone bring you a tray if you'd prefer rest after your journey." Natalie straightened her shoulders. "I'll come to supper, thank you. I should meet everyone if I'm to be their children's teacher." After Daniel left, Natalie explored her new home. The bedroom contained a double bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, and a washstand with pitcher and bowl. Someone had placed a small bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. She unpacked her meager belongings, changed into one of her new dresses, and did her best to freshen up with the water from the pump. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the strange turn her life had taken in just a few hours. Daniel Everett was an enigma, a rugged cattleman with the manners of a gentleman, and an unexpected concern for the education of the children in his employ. His kindness to a stranded stranger was surprising, yet she didn't sense any ulterior motive behind it. As promised, Daniel came to escort her to dinner an hour later. The main house was impressive up close, 2 stories of solid logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Lamplight glowed from the windows, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted out. "Nervous?" Daniel asked as they approached. "A bit," Natalie admitted. "Good folks," he assured her, curious but welcoming. Inside, Natalie was introduced to a bewildering array of people: Jake Wilson, the foreman, and his wife Mary; the Mexican cook, Miguel, and his wife Elena; 3 cowboys with their wives and various children ranging from toddlers to teenagers; and Martha, an older widow who served as housekeeper for the main house. They were seated at a long table in a large dining room. The food was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from what Elena proudly described as her garden. Throughout the meal, Natalie found herself fielding questions about Boston, her journey west, and her qualifications as a teacher. She answered honestly but carefully, aware of the scrutiny but heartened by the genuine interest. "When can you start teaching?" asked a boy of about 12, earning a gentle reprimand from his mother for his directness. "Well," Natalie smiled at his enthusiasm, "I'll need a few days to assess what books and materials we have, and to understand what levels everyone is at. Perhaps next Monday." Daniel, seated at the head of the table, nodded. "The old bunkhouse can serve as a schoolroom. It's empty now that we built the new one. Jake and the men can fix it up this week." Plans were made, suggestions offered, and by the end of the meal, Natalie felt cautiously optimistic about her new position. These people seemed eager to have their children educated, and while their lifestyle was foreign to her, their values and hopes were familiar enough. After dinner, Daniel walked her back to her cabin, carrying a lantern to light their way through the darkness. "Thank you," Natalie said quietly as they reached her door. "Everyone was very kind." "They're good people," Daniel replied. "Work hard, take care of their own." He handed her the lantern. "Rest well, Miss Morrison. Tomorrow I'll show you around the ranch, introduce you to the rest of the operation." "Good night, Mr. Everett," she said, suddenly shy. "And thank you again for everything." He tipped his hat and melted into the darkness, leaving Natalie to enter her new home alone, her mind whirling with impressions and possibilities. The first weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Daniel had the old bunkhouse converted into a schoolroom, complete with desks fashioned by the ranch's carpenter, a blackboard brought from town, and a collection of books donated by various households. Natalie's 12 students ranged from 6-year-old Maria, who spoke more Spanish than English, to 17-year-old Thomas, who was more interested in ranch work than academics, but attended at his father's insistence. The diversity of ages and abilities made teaching challenging, but Natalie discovered she thrived on the challenge. She settled into a routine, teaching from 8 until 2, then spending afternoons preparing lessons, helping with ranch chores, or exploring the beautiful countryside around the Everett property. Evenings were often spent in the main house, where the ranch families gathered for meals and socializing. Daniel was frequently absent during the days, riding out with his men to check on cattle, mend fences, or handle business matters in town. But he made a point of checking on the school's progress regularly, sometimes sitting quietly at the back of the room observing a lesson. One evening about a month after her arrival, Natalie was sitting on her porch watching the sunset when Daniel approached on horseback. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. "Evening, Miss Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "Mind if I join you?" "Please do," she replied, gesturing to the second chair on the porch. Daniel sat, stretching his long legs out before him. "School seems to be going well. Children talk about nothing else at supper." Natalie smiled. "They're making good progress. Even Thomas is showing interest in mathematics now that I've shown him how it applies to cattle breeding." "Smart thinking," Daniel nodded approvingly, "making it relevant to their lives." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Our month's trial is up tomorrow," Daniel said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. She had almost forgotten their original arrangement. "So it is," she replied, equally careful. "Thought we should discuss whether you wish to continue," he said, glancing at her. "I understand if you've had second thoughts or if ranch life isn't what you expected." "You want me to leave?" Natalie asked directly. Daniel looked surprised. "No. Children are learning well. You seem to have settled in." He paused. "But it's your decision." Natalie considered for a moment, though her mind was already made up. "I'd like to stay," she said simply. "I enjoy teaching the children and I've grown fond of this place." The relief on Daniel's face was evident, though he tried to mask it. "Good," he said. "That's settled then." But something had shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that her presence on the ranch had become more than a mere business arrangement. As summer gave way to fall, Natalie found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet rancher. Daniel was unlike any man she had known in Boston, straightforward in his speech, honest in his dealings, and possessed of a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding it. She learned more about him through casual conversations and stories told by others. He had fought for the Union in the Civil War, barely more than a boy when he enlisted. After the war, disenchanted with the world he'd returned to in Kentucky, he had headed west, seeking a fresh start. He rarely spoke of his past, but one evening as they sat on her porch sharing coffee, he surprised her with a confidence. "Had a wife once," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Sarah. Married her before I went to war. She died of fever while I was away fighting." "I'm so sorry," Natalie said softly. Daniel nodded, accepting her sympathy. "Was a long time ago now, but it changed me, made me understand that life doesn't give guarantees." "Is that why you came west?" "Partly," he admitted. "Wanted somewhere new, somewhere without memories." Natalie understood that impulse all too well. Her own journey west had been driven by a similar desire to escape the painful reminders of her father's death and the subsequent dissolution of the life she had known. As the weeks passed, their evening conversations became a cherished ritual. Sometimes they discussed books. Daniel was surprisingly well-read for a man who had spent most of his adult life working with cattle. Other times they talked of the ranch, the progress of the students, or the news Daniel brought back from his trips to town. Occasionally, they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The first snow fell in early November, transforming the ranch into a glittering wonderland overnight. Natalie stood at her cabin door that morning, marveling at the beauty of the white-covered landscape. "First snow's always the prettiest," Daniel said, appearing beside her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Wait till February when we've been shoveling it for months." Natalie laughed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "In Boston, the snow turns gray and slushy almost immediately. This is magical. Different here," Daniel agreed. "Stays white longer. Course it also stays longer, period. Winters are no joke in Montana." "I've been warned," Natalie smiled. "Mary gave me quite the lecture about proper winter preparations, and Alina insisted on teaching me to make those wonderful wool socks." Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners. "They've taken to you, that's certain." "And I to them," Natalie admitted. I never expected to find such a sense of belonging here. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, a warmth that made Natalie's heart beat faster. But he merely nodded and changed the subject to practical matters of winter on the ranch. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, life on the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. With fewer outdoor tasks demanding immediate attention, the ranch hands focused on repairs to equipment, care of the cattle in the winter pastures nearest the house, and preparations for the spring calving season. For Natalie, this meant fuller attendance in her schoolroom, as even the older boys who sometimes missed school during busy periods were now present every day. She expanded her curriculum, challenging her students with more advanced material and watching with satisfaction as they rose to meet her expectations. The winter also brought the community closer together. With travel to town limited by weather conditions, entertainment had to be created at home. Saturday evenings in the main house became a tradition, music provided by those who could play instruments, storytelling, games, and occasionally dancing. It was during one of these evenings, as Christmas approached, that Natalie truly began to understand the depth of her feelings for Daniel. Miguel was playing his guitar while his wife Elena sang a beautiful Spanish carol. The room was warm and festive, decorated with pine boughs and candles. The children were playing a game in one corner, while the adults sat listening to the music or engaged in quiet conversation. Natalie glanced across the room and found Daniel watching her, his expression unguarded for once. The tenderness in his gaze took her breath away. When their eyes met, he didn't look away as he might have once done. Instead, he smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes and sent a flutter through her chest. Later, as he walked her back to her cabin through the snow, a comfortable silence enveloped them. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant above them, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. At her door, Daniel hesitated. "Miss Morrison, Natalie," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Christmas is coming. Thought you might like to go into town, pick out some gifts for the children, maybe something for yourself too." "I'd like that," she replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Good," he nodded. "Tomorrow if the weather holds." The trip to town the next day marked a turning point in their relationship. Away from the ranch and its constant activity, they found themselves more at ease with each other. Daniel showed her around Dillon, introducing her to shopkeepers and townspeople with a proprietorial pride that did not go unnoticed by the locals. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, a luxury after months of ranch cooking, good though it was. Over their meal, Daniel surprised her again. "Been thinking," he said after their plates had been cleared away. "School's going well, children are learning, but they could use more books, slates, proper desks instead of our makeshift ones." "They're doing remarkably well with what we have," Natalie assured him. Still, Daniel persisted. "Thought maybe come spring we could build a proper schoolhouse, something permanent." The implication wasn't lost on Natalie. This was a long-term plan, one that assumed her continued presence at the ranch. "That would be wonderful," she said carefully, "but it's a significant investment." Daniel met her eyes directly. "Worth it. Education's important, and—" He hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "Hope you'll be staying on. Children need consistency." "Just the children?" Natalie asked softly, surprising herself with her boldness. A flush crept up Daniel's neck. "Not just the children," he admitted. "Place is different with you there. Better." It was the closest he had come to expressing his feelings, and Natalie felt her heart swell with emotion. "I have no plans to leave," she assured him. "I found something at Everett Ranch I never expected." "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. "Home," she said simply. The look that passed between them then needed no words to interpret. Their Christmas shopping completed, they headed back to the ranch as the short winter day began to fade. Snow had started falling again, gentle flakes that drifted down from a steel-gray sky. About halfway home, the weather worsened dramatically. The gentle snowfall transformed into driving sleet that stung their faces and made visibility poor. Daniel urged the horses to greater speed, concern etched on his features. "Blizzard coming," he shouted over the rising wind. "Need to get back before it hits full force." But the storm moved faster than they could. Within minutes, they could barely see the road ahead. The horses struggled against the mounting snowdrifts and biting wind. "Can't make it to the ranch," Daniel finally decided. "Line shacks closer. We'll shelter there." He turned the team off the main trail, following what seemed to Natalie like an invisible path through the swirling snow. She trusted his knowledge of the land implicitly, but couldn't help the flutter of anxiety in her chest as the storm intensified around them. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, a dark shape loomed ahead, a small cabin, barely visible through the blinding snow. Daniel pulled the wagon as close as possible to its door. "Stay here until I get the horses secured," he instructed, jumping down into snow that reached above his boots. Natalie watched anxiously as he unhitched the team and led them to a lean-to shelter attached to the side of the cabin. Once they were secured with feed, he returned for her, helping her through the deep snow to the cabin door. Inside, it was cold and dark, but blessedly free from the howling wind. Daniel moved with purpose, lighting a lantern that hung by the door, then kneeling to start a fire in the small stove that dominated one wall of the single-room structure. "What is this place?" Natalie asked, teeth chattering as she hugged herself for warmth. "Line shack," Daniel explained, his breath visible in the cold air. "For the men when they're working cattle too far from the ranch to return at night. Basic, but it'll keep us alive until the storm passes." The fire caught and Daniel added more wood, building it carefully. "Should warm up soon," he promised. "There's supplies here, food, blankets." As the cabin slowly warmed, Natalie began to take in their surroundings. The line shack was primitive but functional, a small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bunk built into one wall, shelves holding canned goods and other supplies, and pegs on the wall where Daniel had hung their snow-covered coats. "Should have seen this coming," Daniel said grimly, opening a can of beans to heat on the stove. "Signs were there. My fault for not paying attention." "You couldn't have known," Natalie reassured him. "The snow started so gently." Daniel shook his head. "Been ranching here long enough to read the weather. Was distracted." He glanced at her, then away, thinking about other things. There was something in his tone that made Natalie's pulse quicken despite the cold. "Well, we're safe now," she said, moving closer to the warmth of the stove. "How long do you think we'll need to stay? Storm like this could last a day or more," he said. "Folks at the ranch will know we've taken shelter. They won't worry too much." The implications of their situation began to dawn on Natalie. They were alone, stranded together in this tiny cabin, possibly for days. In Boston, such a circumstance would be scandalous, ruinous to a woman's reputation. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel said quietly, "I'll sleep on the floor. You take the bunk." "Don't be ridiculous," Natalie replied practically. "It's freezing and that floor won't get much warmer no matter how good the fire is. We're adults. We can share the bunk without impropriety." Daniel looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Not concerned about your reputation." Natalie laughed softly. "I think living alone on a ranch full of cowboys has already tested the limits of Boston propriety, don't you? Besides, who's to know or care out here?" Daniel's expression turned serious. "I care," he said simply. "About your reputation, about you." The directness of his statement caught Natalie off guard. In the months they had known each other, there had been an unspoken attraction, a growing closeness, but neither had put their feelings into words. "I care about you too, Daniel," she said softly, using his given name deliberately. Something shifted in his eyes, then a decision made, a barrier crossed. He moved closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the chill that still lingered in the cabin. "Natalie," he said, his voice roughened with emotion, "need to be clear about something." She looked up at him, heart hammering in her chest. "Yes. When I found you on that train platform," he began, "offered you a place to stay, a job, had no expectations beyond helping someone in need." "I know that," she assured him. "But now," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "now things are different. My feelings are different." Natalie held her breath, waiting. "I'm not a man who speaks easily of such things," Daniel said, the words coming with evident difficulty. "But you should know. You've become important to me, more than important." "Daniel," Natalie whispered, her voice catching. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Don't expect anything," he said quickly. "Just wanted you to know, in case this storm made you realize you've had enough of Montana winters and ranch life." Natalie felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Not unless you ask me to leave." "Never," he said hoarsely, and then he was pulling her closer, one hand moving to cradle her face with exquisite tenderness. When his lips met hers, Natalie felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Been wanting to do that for months," he admitted. Natalie smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "What took you so long, Cowboy?" he laughed then, a rich, warm sound that filled the small cabin. "Wasn't sure a Boston lady would want a rough rancher like me." "This Boston lady does," she assured him, drawing him down for another kiss. They spent the night talking, sharing the narrow bunk with a propriety that belied the passion of their earlier kisses. Daniel told her more about his past, his childhood in Kentucky, the horrors he'd witnessed in the war, his journey west, and the years of hard work that had built his ranch from nothing. Natalie spoke of her own life, her father's scholarly pursuits that had left their family financially vulnerable, her mother's death when she was young, the struggle to maintain appearances as their fortunes declined, and finally, her decision to seek independence in the West when her father's death left her without resources or protectors. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known," Daniel said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Natalie smiled at the compliment. "Not brave, just desperate. Takes courage to step onto a train bound for a place you've never seen with nothing but hope to sustain you," he insisted. "I had a job offer," she reminded him, "or so I thought." "Their loss," Daniel said simply. "Our gain." The blizzard raged for 2 days, keeping them confined to the line shack. They made the best of their supplies, playing cards, reading from the small collection of books kept in the cabin, and talking for hours. Their physical relationship remained chaste, though the attraction between them grew with each passing hour. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to silence. The howling wind had ceased, and sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, reflecting blindingly off the snow outside. Daniel opened the door cautiously, revealing a transformed world. Snow lay in huge drifts, some taller than a man, while in other places the wind had scoured the ground nearly bare. The sky above was a perfect, pristine blue. "Beautiful," Natalie breathed, joining him at the doorway. "Dangerous too," Daniel cautioned. Drifts can hide all sorts of hazards. But the trail back to the ranch should be passable. Men will have been working to clear it. Sure enough, by mid-morning they spotted riders approaching Jake Wilson and two other cowboys, coming to check on them. The men's relief at finding them safe was evident, as was their careful avoidance of any comments about the impropriety of their situation. The return to the ranch was slow but steady, the way having been partially cleared by the ranch hands. When they arrived, they were greeted with a mixture of relief and knowing looks that made Natalie blush despite her best efforts. That evening, after a hearty meal and many retellings of their adventure, Daniel walked Natalie back to her cabin as usual. But this time when they reached her door, he took both her hands in his. "Been thinking," he said without preamble, "about us, about the future." Natalie felt her heart begin to race. "Have you?" "Yes," he nodded firmly. 2 days trapped in that line shack made some things very clear to me." "What things?" she asked softly. "That I don't want to walk you to this cabin and leave you here night after night," he said bluntly. "That I want a life with you, Natalie, a real life together." She felt tears stinging her eyes. "Daniel, I know it's fast," he interrupted. "No, we've only known each other a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything. Love you, Natalie Morrison. Want to marry you if you'll have me." The directness of his proposal was so typically Daniel that Natalie couldn't help but laugh through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." His face broke into a smile of such radiant joy that it took her breath away. Then he was pulling her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise that words could not express. They were married 2 weeks later in the Dillon church, with the entire ranch community and half the town in attendance. The winter landscape provided a breathtaking backdrop for a celebration that combined traditional elements with the practical realities of ranch life in winter. Natalie wore a dress of deep blue velvet, not the traditional white, but beautiful nonetheless, ordered specially from a dressmaker in town. Daniel looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his usual confident demeanor somewhat dampened by the formal clothes and public setting. But when he spoke his vows, his voice was clear and certain, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their friends and neighbors seemed to shake the small church to its foundations. The celebration afterward, held in the main house at the ranch, lasted well into the night. There was dancing and feasting, storytelling and laughter. Natalie found herself overwhelmed at times by the genuine affection shown by people who had been strangers to her just months before. "Happy?" Daniel asked, finding a moment alone with her as the celebration continued around them. "More than I knew was possible," she answered truthfully, leaning into his embrace. "Good," he nodded, satisfied. "Aim to keep you that way." Later that night, when they were finally alone in the main house, now their home together, as they had decided the cabin would become the new schoolhouse, Daniel drew her into his arms with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Everett," he whispered against her hair. And Natalie knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she had found where she belonged. Spring came to the Montana high country with explosive suddenness. One day there was snow on the ground. The next, green shoots were pushing up through the melting drifts, and the air was filled with the sounds of water running and birds returning from their winter migration. For Natalie, that first spring as Daniel's wife brought a whirlwind of new experiences. There was the cattle drive to summer pastures higher in the hills, the frenzy of calving season with its round-the-clock vigilance, and the planting of the large vegetable garden that would help feed the ranch through the coming year. Through it all, she continued teaching, now in the former cabin that had been expanded and outfitted as a proper schoolroom. The children thrived under her guidance, and word spread to neighboring ranches. Soon, families from miles around were sending their children to the Everett Ranch School, some boarding with ranch families during the week due to the distance. Daniel took immense pride in his wife's success, bragging about the school to anyone who would listen when he went to town. But more than that, he took joy in their life together, in the simple pleasure of waking beside her each morning, in their conversations over meals, in watching her adapt to and embrace ranch life with a determination that matched his own. Their physical relationship had blossomed too, a passion between them that sometimes left them both breathless and wondering at their good fortune. They fit together perfectly, their bodies finding a harmony that mirrored the deepening connection of their hearts and minds. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Natalie turned to her husband with a smile that held a secret. "I have news," she said softly. Daniel looked at her inquiringly, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "Good news or concerning news, the very best news," she assured him, "though it may complicate the teaching arrangements come spring." It took him a moment to understand her meaning, but when he did, his face transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Natalie nodded, her eyes shining. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a child, Daniel." He gathered her into his arms with exquisite gentleness, as though she had suddenly become fragile as glass. "When?" he asked, his hand moving to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "April, the doctor thinks," she replied. "Just when the new calves are arriving." Daniel laughed, the sound rich with happiness. Perfect timing, new life everywhere. The months of Natalie's pregnancy passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Daniel became even more protective of her, insisting she rest more and take on fewer responsibilities. This led to their first serious disagreement as a married couple, with Natalie firmly asserting her ability to continue teaching and managing the household while carrying their child. "Women have been having babies while working since the beginning of time," Daniel Everett, she informed him one evening after he had attempted to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I am not an invalid, and this baby and I will be perfectly fine without you hovering like a mother hen." Daniel had looked sheepish but unrepentant. "Just want to take care of you both," he said stubbornly. Natalie's expression softened. "I know and I love you for it, but you need to trust me to know my limits." They reached a compromise. Natalie would continue teaching and performing light household duties, but would accept help with more strenuous tasks and rest when tired. It was a solution that satisfied them both and set a pattern for their marriage disagreements resolved through honest communication and mutual respect. As winter settled over the ranch once more, Natalie found herself reflecting on the extraordinary changes in her life over the past year. From a desperate young woman alone on a train platform to a beloved wife, respected teacher, and soon-to-be mother, the transformation seemed almost too remarkable to be real. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said one evening as they sat by the fire, Natalie's hands busy with knitting a tiny blanket while Daniel worked on ranch accounts. "I was just thinking about that day at the train station," she replied. "How close I came to refusing your offer." Daniel set aside his paperwork. "What changed your mind?" Natalie considered the question. "Something in your eyes," she finally said. "There was kindness there and honesty. I was desperate, yes, but not so desperate that I would have gone with just anyone." She smiled at him. "You seemed safe somehow, trustworthy." "Glad you thought so," he said quietly. "Best decision of my life bringing you home." "Mine too," she agreed, her hand moving to rest on her growing belly. Though I never imagined this outcome when I climbed into your wagon that day. No regrets?" he asked, and though his tone was light, Natalie could hear the genuine question beneath. "Not a single one," she assured him, meaning it with all her heart. April arrived with its characteristic unpredictability: snow one day, warm sunshine the next. Calving season was in full swing, keeping Daniel and the ranch hands busy day and night. Natalie had reluctantly given up teaching the month before, her body too unwieldy now for the long days on her feet. It was during a late spring snowstorm that their child decided to make his appearance. The labor began in the early morning hours, waking Natalie from a sound sleep. Daniel, exhausted from a night helping a heifer with a difficult birth, was initially confused by her announcement, but sprang into action immediately. Jake was sent to town to fetch the doctor, while Mary and Alina were summoned to assist. The women took charge efficiently, shooing Daniel from the bedroom with assurances that first babies often took their time and there was no need for panic. But as the hours passed and Natalie's labor intensified, Daniel's anxiety grew. He paced the house like a caged mountain lion, wincing at each cry from the bedroom, cursing the snowstorm that was delaying the doctor's arrival. Finally, just as dusk was falling, a lusty cry broke the tension: the unmistakable sound of a newborn announcing his presence to the world. Minutes later, Mary appeared at the bedroom door, her face tired but beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Everett," she announced. "Strong and healthy as a new colt, and your wife is doing just fine." Daniel entered the bedroom with uncharacteristic hesitation, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Natalie lay against the pillows, her face flushed and hair damp with perspiration, but her eyes shining with a joy that took his breath away. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in the blanket she had knitted. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Daniel approached the bed and gazed down at the tiny red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened them briefly, eyes of startling blue. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're perfect. I love you both so much." "We're thinking of naming him James," Natalie said, watching her husband's face. "After my father. James Daniel Everett. If you approve." Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He reached out a tentative finger to touch his son's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin and the miracle of his existence. Dr. Simmons arrived an hour later, having battled through the snow with Jake. He examined both mother and baby, pronouncing them to be in excellent health. "You did well without me," he told Natalie with a smile, "though I'd have spared you some of the discomfort if I'd been here sooner." "I had excellent help," Natalie assured him, glancing gratefully at Mary and Alina, who had remained by her side throughout. The news of James Daniel Everett's birth spread quickly through the ranch and into town. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes: handmade toys, tiny clothes, offers of help with household tasks while Natalie recovered. Daniel found himself experiencing a pride unlike anything he had known before in his son, certainly, but even more in his wife, whose courage and strength through the ordeal of childbirth had increased his already considerable admiration for her. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. The ranch prospered under Daniel's careful management, expanding to include more land and cattle. Natalie's school grew in reputation, eventually becoming so successful that they had to hire an additional teacher to help with the growing number of students. James was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Sarah, born 2 years after him, and later by another brother, William Thomas. The Everett children grew up with the ranch as their playground and classroom, learning both academics from their mother and practical skills from their father, and the ranch hands. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were harsh winters, drought summers, occasional conflicts with neighboring ranchers over water rights or grazing boundaries, and the constant, demanding work of maintaining a successful cattle operation. But through it all, Daniel and Natalie's partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced every challenge together, drawing strength from each other and from the family and community they had built. 10 years after their meeting at the Dillon train station, they celebrated their anniversary with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from miles around. The ranch had grown considerably. New buildings had been added, including a large, purpose-built schoolhouse that served children from throughout the county. That evening, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Daniel and Natalie sat on the porch of their home, much as they had that evening when she had told him about expecting James. "Happy?" Daniel asked, echoing the question he had asked her on their wedding night. Natalie leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted: a home, a family, a purpose." Daniel shook his head. "You had all that in you already," he said. "I just provided the setting." "Either way," she smiled up at him, "I'm grateful every day that you found me on that train platform and took a chance on a stranded Boston schoolteacher." "Best decision I ever made," Daniel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Taking your trunk and saying come live." "And the best decision I ever made was saying yes," Natalie replied. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, watching the stars emerge over the Montana mountains, Natalie reflected that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single moment of courage, the courage to trust a stranger, to leave the familiar behind, to begin again. Her journey had brought her here, to this ranch, this man, these children, this life. A life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. That day, she stood alone and afraid on the Dillon train platform. Daniel's arm tightened around her shoulders, as if he could read her thoughts. No words were needed between them, just the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The children grew, James following in his father's footsteps with a natural aptitude for ranching, Elizabeth showing her mother's love of books and teaching, and William developing an unexpected talent for medicine that eventually led him to medical school in Denver. The 20th century arrived, bringing with it new technologies and ideas that gradually transformed life, even in remote Montana. Daniel, always forward-thinking, was among the first ranchers in the area to introduce new breeding techniques, to experiment with different feeds and grazing methods, and eventually to bring the first automobile to the ranch, a purchase that caused nearly as much excitement as the birth of any of the children had. Natalie, too, embraced change. Her school evolved with the times, incorporating new teaching methods and expanding its curriculum. When Montana finally granted women the right to vote in 1914, she was among the first at the polls, proudly casting her ballot with Daniel by her side, equally proud of his progressive-minded wife. They weathered personal losses as well, the deaths of old friends, the departure of grown children for lives elsewhere, the gradual slowing down that came with advancing age. Daniel's hair turned from dark to silver, while lines of laughter and experience etched themselves around Natalie's eyes. But to each other, they remained as beautiful as they had been in their youth. On the 40th anniversary of their meeting that fateful day at the Dillon train station, they took a special journey together. Now in their 60s, with the daily management of the ranch largely in James's capable hands, They had the freedom to indulge in nostalgia. They traveled by automobile to Dillon, parking near the train station that had been modernized but still retained elements of its 1884 structure. Hand in hand, they walked onto the platform where they had first met. "It looks smaller than I remember," Natalie observed, gazing around at the familiar yet changed surroundings. "You were seeing it through the eyes of fear then," Daniel suggested. "Everything looks larger when you're afraid." Natalie nodded, remembering vividly the desperation she had felt that day alone without prospects, her future uncertain. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but trying so hard not to show it." "You didn't," Daniel assured her. "Looked composed as a queen." "That's what caught my attention first, this elegant Boston lady, standing so straight and dignified despite being obviously stranded. And what made you offer me a place to stay, a job? It was quite extraordinary, looking back on it." Daniel considered the question seriously. "Something in your eyes," he finally said, echoing her own explanation from years before. "Courage, determination. Too much pride to beg, but too much sense to refuse help when it was needed." He squeezed her hand. "Knew you were special, didn't know how special until later." They spent the day revisiting places from their early days together, the general store where they had purchased supplies, now expanded and modernized. The church where they had been married, largely unchanged. The hotel dining room where Daniel had first hinted at his feelings, now part of a much grander establishment. As the day waned, they drove back to the ranch, their home, the place where they had built a life together from nothing but hope and hard work. The Everett Ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in Montana, known for its progressive practices, quality stock, and the school that still bore Natalie's influence, though she had retired from active teaching years before. That evening, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebratory dinner. 3 generations of Everetts filled the dining room with laughter and conversation, each person carrying some visible or invisible trace of the couple who had started it all. James, now a respected rancher in his own right, had his father's steady gaze and quiet authority. Elizabeth, who had taken over the school when Natalie retired, possessed her mother's passion for education and literature. William, home from Denver where he practiced medicine, combined his father's practicality with his mother's compassion. And the grandchildren, 7 of them now, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, each carried forward some aspect of the legacy Daniel and Natalie had created together. After dinner, as the family gathered in the large living room, James raised a glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his deep voice filled with emotion, "who taught us by example what it means to build something lasting. Who showed us that love is found in the everyday acts of kindness and support as much as in grand gestures. Who created not just a successful ranch, but a home where everyone is welcome and valued." Glasses were raised all around, and Daniel and Natalie, seated side by side as they had been for 4 decades, accepted the tribute with misty eyes. Later, when the younger children had been put to bed, and the adults had moved to the porch to enjoy the mild summer evening, Elizabeth approached her parents with an old, leather-bound book in her hands. "I found this when we were cleaning out the old schoolhouse," she explained, holding it out to her mother. "I thought you might like to have it back." Natalie took the book, recognizing it immediately her journal from that first year at the ranch. She had recorded her experiences, thoughts, and growing feelings for Daniel in its pages, then set it aside as life became busier with marriage and children. "Thank you," she said softly, running her fingers over the worn cover. "I had forgotten all about this." That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Daniel and Natalie sat up in bed together, reading the journal by the light of a bedside lamp. The words transported them back across the decades to those first uncertain days, the gradual blossoming of their love, the hopes and dreams they had shared. "Listen to this," Natalie said, reading from an entry dated just after their marriage. "I cannot believe how my life has transformed in the space of a few short months. From despair to hope, from loneliness to belonging, from uncertainty to purpose. Daniel has given me not just a home, but a future I could never have imagined for myself. I pray I can be for him what he has been for me, a partner, a support, a safe harbor in life's storms." Daniel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You have been," he assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "All that and more." They continued reading, occasionally laughing at forgotten incidents or marveling at how clearly Natalie had captured moments that had faded in their memories. It was like rediscovering their own story, seeing it fresh through the eyes of their younger selves. When they finally closed the journal and turned out the light, they lay together in the darkness, hands clasped as they had been nearly every night for 40 years. "You ever wonder," Natalie asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't been at the station that day? If you hadn't offered me a place to stay?" "Sometimes," Daniel admitted. "Would have missed out on everything that matters most. Can't imagine my life without you in it." "Nor I without you," she whispered. They fell silent, contemplating the extraordinary chain of circumstances that had brought them together, her desperate journey west, the job that had fallen through, his unexpected appearance at just the right moment. So many things that could have gone differently, that might have led them along entirely separate paths. "We've been fortunate," Daniel said finally. "More than most." "Yes," Natalie agreed, thinking of the life they had built together, the family they had raised, the community they had helped to shape. "Very fortunate indeed." As sleep began to claim them, Natalie's thoughts returned to that long-ago day, the heat, the dust, the fear, and then the appearance of a tall cowboy who had lifted her trunk and said two simple words that had changed her life forever. "Come live," he had said, and she had taken the greatest risk of her life in agreeing, a risk that had yielded the greatest rewards she could have imagined. And as she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had been her partner through 40 years of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, Natalie knew with absolute certainty that if she could somehow go back to that moment on the train platform, knowing all that would follow, the hard work, the occasional heartaches, the sacrifices and compromises, she would make exactly the same choice again. For some journeys, once begun, reveal themselves to be exactly the path you were meant to travel all along. And some strangers, once met, prove to be the very person your soul has been waiting for across time and distance. Daniel and Natalie Everett had found each other against all odds, and in doing so, had found the home they each had been searching for, not just a place, but a person, a partnership, a shared life of purpose and love. And in the end, there could be no greater fortune than that.